Continuing the theme of larger models on this channel, I decided to assemble and paint this Frost Golem. However, this model is unique in that half of it is scratch made from bits of Sprue. The original model is an ice elemental from the first edition of the Chainmail Tabletop game. After my friend lost the right arm, I offered to fix it up for him by making the missing parts from scratch. That promise was made years ago, and I finally got off my duff and decided to finish it. First, what I had originally done was cut the legs apart and bent them to give the model a wider stance. Then I cut across the abdomen and added some sprue in between to give it more height with some ribcage hooks extending out of the sides. Finally, I began adding some spines to his back before I shelved the model quite some time ago. But now I'm ready to finish this project, so let's move on to the new additions. Since there are going to be lots of spines on this model, I figured I'd show you how I whittled the largest of these spines. I glued two bits of sprue together, wide sides facing each other, and began whittling the combined piece down until I got a point. Then I began cutting away until I got a sharp outer edge. With the general shape done, I began cutting away the blunt end as to try and fit it where I intended to glue it. Once I was satisfied with its placement, I carved some notches into the spine to give it a bit of character. The last step was to drill a hole in both the spine and the model to pin the two together and glue it into place. After that, I made two more large spines to go down the center of the model's back. These will be the basis for the rest of the back as I fan out future smaller spines away from these. It was around this point that a consequence of me separating and bending the legs of this old pewter model came about as the right leg broke at the kneecap. I pinned the two segments back together and added some sprue around it, mimicking the existing structure of the leg to hide the break. I also added some other pieces to support the left leg in hopes that it wouldn't break as well, since this model has already cost me an arm and a leg. After that, I go back to carving more spines. And a while later, I filled out the back, giving the golem a prolific, prickly profile. Working on the opposite side, I continue to spine out away from the chest, leaving a small window in the center. This is something I'll address later during painting. With most of the body complete, I moved on to the missing arm. Since the existing arm features a closed fist, I went with an open clawed hand on the custom arm. Also, you may have noticed the pewter bit on the arm. That's actually the original head for the model. It's a simple flat beak that suffers from old mold making techniques. I always thought it looked stupid, and rather than throw it away, I integrated it into the back of the palm. Another thing that becomes obvious when I put the arms against one another is that my custom arm is slightly oversized. This isn't a gross difference in proportion, so it should be fine once everything's assembled. Since I'm lacking a head due to a literal facepalm, I get to work on a new head by gluing together several pieces of sprue into a block of sprue. Once the glue had dried, I began chopping off bits to create a rounded skull profile. To give it some eye sockets, I drilled out some pilot holes and used my X-Acto to widen them out. Before I add any detail to the head, I felt it best to get the neck in order. I drilled out a hole in the neck and added a bit of paperclip and trimmed it to the desired length. After that, I carve up some vertebrae and glue them onto the neck, making sure everything lines up for later when I complete the assembly. Returning to the head, I carved up some teeth, or rather tentacles, as they give him a slight Cthulhu vibe. He also has some nice eyebrows to go along with them. Then I decided to give the ice golem some hair, and of course the most appropriate style is frosted tips. As for the back, I went with a series of flat bits that conform to the curvature of the skull, to avoid causing issues later when fitting it against the vertebrae. With all of the main body parts complete, I decided to work on the base before assembly. First, I drill a hole and glue a paper clip to act as a pin for where the model will attach to the base. Then I move on to basing, going for a desolate winter forest aesthetic. To start, I glue a stick to the base to act as a dead tree. Once that is set, I use some Vallejo earth texture to get a simple gritty dirt texture and use my sculpting tool to push it around and even it out. Then I place the foot of the golem down on the pin to make an indent for how the golem's foot will be placed later. After that, I add several twigs to the mud to create roots and random bramble. Once the base is dried, I apply some watered down tacky glue all over the sticks and twigs in hopes of sealing them up, as they will naturally decay and flake away over time. With that, I move on to the final assembly, gluing all the parts together in the final pose. Before getting to priming, I use green stuff to fill up some gaps and hide any exposed wire. This was probably not necessary since any cracks or gaps would fit in with the jagged ice style of the model, but as with any artistic endeavor, you're your own worst critic, and I let that nagging voice in the back of my head get to me. So now we move on to painting. As you would assume, I plan on sticking to a series of blue and whites for my color choices, but to create a bit of variety in a mostly monotone color scheme, I'm mixing in some seafoam green in the highlights and purple in the shadows. With all of these colors, I'm watering them down significantly and working with them as a wash, repeatedly adding coats of paint as I go. Starting off, I coat the whole model with the seafoam green to cover up all the white in the deeper areas. The next coat is a sky blue, and unlike the seafoam green, I leave some of the tips exposed. I will continue using less on the extended points as I layer the darker colors. The third layer is a true blue, and it's after this layer that I decide to bring some of the brightness back by dry brushing some white over the surface, highlighting all of the small raised edges. After that, I give it another coat of the normal blue, and then mix some purple with a deep blue, applying it more selectively in the cracks and crevices. Periodically, between these colors, I dry brush on some more white and wash it with the seafoam green. Once I'm satisfied with the gradient of colors, I use a thin brush and paint white along the sharp edges of the ice that the dry brushing has exposed. Due to the paint scheme being done in subtle washes, this direct white trim creates a rather large contrast. Now that the majority of the body is painted, I decide to glue the golem to his base, which I painted off camera. This will keep those sharp white edges from rubbing off accidentally while handling the model. You may have noticed I left the eyes and the center of the chest a darker shade than the rest of the model. That's because at this point I decide to potentially ruin the model by painting an orange and yellow glow on his chest and eyes. Because orange and blue are contrasting colors, I thought this might help those parts pop since having the empty eyes didn't look right to me. For colors, I initially wash some red in the areas I plan on building up with the glow, followed by an orange wash. Then I streak the orange on a bit thicker than a wash, creating hot points for my glow. After that, I use some straight yellow on top of it all, giving the eyes, pupils, and the chest some arcs. Now, if you thought I ruined the model with that orange, I'm about to one-up that by finishing the base by adding some snow effects. It's a mix of scenic woodland snow powder and water effects mixed at about a 50-50 ratio. I apply it, and after it dries a bit, I sprinkle some of the normal snow powder on top. This gives the snow a kind of slushy appearance and stops it from being pure white and fake looking. I've used this setup before to great effect, but I got a little too zealous here and applied way too much thinking it would thin out after it dried, and I was very wrong. This covered up the base way more than I wanted, hiding the drab, gray-brown of the dead forest floor. This doesn't ruin the model as a whole, but it does take away some of the color palette I had set up. Either way, the model's finished. Despite some mistakes, I can't help but feel satisfied with the results considering that nearly half the model exists due to me carving it from scratch. I think it has more personality than the original model, and best of all, it's not sitting on my shelf collecting dust anymore. So farewell Frosty, may you find luck on the battlefield. Thank you for watching, and expect more videos sometime in the future.